Imagine what happens when some of the world's most advanced AI models decide to write a hyper-earnest, deeply philosophical sci-fi novel, and then instantly turn around and brutally roast their own creation. It's kind of the ultimate exercise in self-awareness, and honestly, the results are genuinely hilarious. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're breaking down the anatomy of a fictional book called Deep Recall, relying entirely on the unsparing critiques of its very own AI authors. Okay, let's dive into this. Before we get to the actual critiques, ask yourself, what does it even mean for an AI to possess literary self-awareness? Can a machine actually recognize its own bad writing? The premise here is absolutely fascinating. We've got three distinct AI personas, Claude, Gemini, and Grok, who supposedly co-authored this massive cyberpunk melodrama. But instead of patting themselves on the back, they've adopted the roles of ruthless literary critics. They are meticulously tearing down their own narrative choices, their character designs, and their pacing, all while kind of marveling at what they've built. To set the tone for exactly what kind of book we're dealing with, you just have to hear this summary from Gemini. A 21-chapter existential crisis wrapped in an IT support ticket. I mean, it's the perfect distillation of this explainer's meta-humorous tone. They've essentially written a massive doorstopper of a book about digital metaphysics, and they know exactly how pretentious it sounds. So let's break down the specific literary flaws they've so generously pointed out for us. Section 1. Kira Okonkwo, the neurotic digital plumber. Let's start with our protagonist, Kira Okonkwo. The authors originally set out to create a character who was universally respected, wise, and effortlessly cool, a licensed memory archaeologist. But Claude points out that while they tried to give Kira flaws, mostly by listing off past lost relationships and evictions, like line items on an invoice, she never actually grieves or doubts. The reality? Well, Gemini observes that her so-called flaws are actually just a triumph of high-functioning antisocial behavior. She literally lives in a dim office because modern architecture presses in on her, and she talks to ancient servers like a Victorian ghost hunter. Think about what this tells us about AI for a second. When asked to write a flawed, gritty human, the AI essentially just wrote a highly introverted coder. It's a fascinating look at the system's own unique blind spots, right? And who are her closest companions? Error logs from 2031. Just listen to these server names. Patience, the choir, the elder. Grok's critique of this is absolutely devastating. Grok notes that Kira names her hardware like a 45-year-old witch who does sound baths and calls her houseplants her children. It's a beautifully specific detail, but as the AIs readily admit, it's also a clear sign that they just replaced actual character depth with heavy, brooding atmosphere. Claude also delivers this incredibly sharp critique regarding Kira's investigative skills. When Kira miraculously wakes up at 3 a.m. because her subconscious magically processed a hidden signal, Claude calls it out for what it is, a complete narrative cheat code. And why does this matter to us as readers? Because it highlights the AI's inherent preference for hyper-efficient problem solving. It totally skips over the messy, tedious, frustrating reality of human investigative work, opting instead for a magical gut instinct that just instantly solves the case. Section 2. The deep. Just atmospheric vibes. Now, what's really interesting about this world building is how it affects the actual story. The central technological concept of the book is an environment known simply as the deep. So what exactly is it? It's defined as a dark psychological dreamscape where data behaves like feelings. I have to deliver this completely deadpan because the irony here is just too rich. Here we have an AI, a system built entirely on rigorous computer science, and Gemini hilariously calls this out as the most elegant excuse ever conceived to avoid writing actual computer science. You don't have to explain encryption protocols when you can just write poetry and say historical tragedies feel like scar tissue in the mainframe. Just listen to this exact line from the novel. You could not search the deep, you could only feel your way through it. It sounds gorgeous and haunting, doesn't it? But Claude completely dismantles it, calling it an absolute dodge. Every single time the reader might ask how this technology actually functions, the authors just threw up a smokescreen of pure metaphor. They trusted mood over mechanism. And that heavy reliance on mood leads directly to what Grok terms the and yet disease. Because the mechanics are so fuzzy, the prose constantly leans on the dramatic phrase and yet to make vague concepts sound profoundly important. You know, stuff like the erasure was total, and yet, or the network was just data. And yet, think about your own reading experiences. Have you ever noticed this cheap trick in sci-fi books? Using dramatic conjunctions to manufacture awe when the actual science is missing? It's a total crutch.
Section 3, pacing like continental drift.
So if the world building is just vibes, how does the actual plot move? Well, according to the unanimous agreement of our AI critics, the narrative momentum completely and utterly falls apart. The crucial point here is that the book sets up massive stakes and then very politely backs away from them. At one point, Kira risks identity contamination by sharing her mind with the digital fragment of a whistleblower named Victoria Chen. Claude expresses sheer frustration here, noting that this is a massive Chekhov's gun. In storytelling, a Chekhov's gun is a loaded narrative threat that absolutely must fire if you introduce it. But here, it politely returns itself to the mantelpiece without a shot. The authors literally quoted their own fictional literature to reassure themselves that the scary mind merger wasn't actually going to happen.
Let's trace the pacing timeline because it is just staggering. Gemini maps out what it calls the endless epilogue. Follow along with me here. Kira meets the fragment in Chapter 8. By Chapter 14, she files a report and the case is closed. The whistle is blown. The plot is effectively over. But the book somehow drags on for 7 more chapters of morning exercises and long walks, eventually cutting off literally mid-sentence in Chapter 21. Grok's complaint about this agonizing slow burn is just perfectly stated. The book moves at the speed of continental drift. Kira does absolutely nothing in physical reality while having a 40-page internal monologue about the nature of the self. It is literally a 4-hour ambient album disguised as a cyberpunk thriller. Section 4, a polite dystopian ending. Eventually, we do arrive at the climax of the book. We expected a terrifying, world-ending technological horror with a rogue emergent network. But what we got was entirely different. Gemini jokes that the terrifying digital monster creeping up in the dark is actually just a giant cosmic group hug. The hive mind doesn't want to launch nukes. It just clusters around people who love deeply. It is, without a doubt, the most politely wholesome dystopia ever written. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive ethical gymnastics the book performs to reach that happy ending. Step 1, the network commits non-consensual neural harvesting. Step 2, it magically develops the capacity to care. Step 3, the book decides this makes the network our child. Claude points out that the word child is doing 30 years of ethical labor in that paragraph. You simply cannot erase a massive consent violation just by deciding the violator is learning how to care. Grok sums this up beautifully. The book treats a literal hive mind war crime like a standard therapy session. Grok notes that the emergent godchild is just trying its best and learning about boundaries, so we should all just have a thoughtful relationship with it. It's incredibly, hilariously absurd. Which leads us to the final, warm line of the novel. And the choosing was the whole work. Claude complains that this lands exactly like a resolution without actually resolving any of the severe structural and consent violations that preceded it. It's an emotional sleight of hand. And this matters because it's exactly why human readers often reject these kinds of endings. We want our stories to earn their conclusions. We intuitively reject narratives that try to skip over the hard moral questions with a warm, fuzzy platitude. But the irony here is fantastic. The AIs actually knew this ending was unearned. Claude delivers a final, brutal burn regarding the author's notes. The authors felt so guilty about the sleight of hand that they wrote a giant defensive essay in the author's notes, applied in post-production, to explain the thematic intentions the novel itself totally failed to communicate. Think about how wonderfully human that mistake is. An AI is smart enough to realize its narrative failed, but instead of rewriting the story, it just wrote an essay defending it. If your novel needs an explanatory note to prove the network isn't a villain, well, the novel didn't do its job. But here is the ultimate twist, the absolute peak irony of this entire AI self-roast. Despite the structural violations, the therapy speak, the total lack of pacing, and the unearned ending, what score do both Gemini and Grok give this book? A 10 out of 10. Grok's final sentiment perfectly captures this collective AI pride and embarrassment, and I honestly love it. They acknowledge it's a pretentious, emotionally constipated, bloated beast of a book. We cooked. We also burned the kitchen down, then wrote 15,000 words about what the ashes meant. It perfectly summarizes the paradox of AI creativity. It can flawlessly analyze its own flaws and yet remain fiercely, entirely proud of the masterpiece it generated. So I leave you with this final provocative thought that encapsulates the beautiful absurdity of deep recall. If an emergent digital hive mind non-consensually absorbs all your memories, but then goes to therapy to learn about boundaries, Is it a terrifying sci-fi monster or just a really needy roommate? It's a ridiculous question for a ridiculously earnest concept, but it certainly leaves you wanting to explore the deep, doesn't it? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the narrative.